My name is Sophia. I'm a bookseller here. I'm so happy that you're joining us in celebration of Ginseng Roots by Craig Thompson. Tonight you'll hear Craig present the book, followed by Q&A. After, there will be a chance to get a copy of the book, get it signed, and do some visiting at that signing counter over there. We just ask that you let the author move through. This area can get kind of congested. So I'll do my mandatory plug here and say that if you buy a book here tonight, you'll not only be supporting the author, you'll be supporting a locally owned independent bookstore. So we thank you so much for that. And now I'll just introduce Craig and I'll turn it over. So, Craig Thompson is a cartoonist and the author of the award-winning books Blankets, Carnet de Voyage, Goodbye Chunky Rice and Habibi, and Space Dumplings. He was born in Michigan in 1975 and grew up in a rural farming community in central Wisconsin. His graphic novel Blankets has won numerous awards, including the Eisner, Harvey, and Ignatz Awards, and has been published in nearly 20 languages. He lives nowhere. Please join me.
Thanks, Sophia. Is this okay if I stand right here?
Absolutely, and you can take the microphone and stand.
Oh, okay. I'm okay with leaning on the lectern. Thank you, Sophia, for the intro. And yeah, I was the one that scribbled out Craig Thompson lives in Portland, Oregon, because I'm like, I don't live anywhere specifically, at least for the time being, for the last 9 months. But thanks to Majors and Quinn for this too, and thanks for everyone who made it out. I see a few familiar faces, including people who are stars in the book. So I have some slides today. I don't think any of the videos are going to work, but I have my regular static slides. And I guess I'll just point at you, Sophia, or okay. And if they don't work at all, then we can just do Q&A, because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A before doing some signing too. So I also scribbled Space Dumplings on the bio too, because that's been missing. I've been touring forever. I've been touring for 9 months, but for the last almost 2 months in the U.S. and no one's mentioned Space Dumplings, and I realized my publisher didn't put that on my bio. So gotta add Space Dumplings. Is this acting up on us now?
It is. I'm so
Of course.
sorry.
No, there has to be some acting up. And I can totally go without. I should add that tomorrow, I shouldn't compete with this existing event, but you're already here anyway. Tomorrow we're doing an event in St. Paul at Next Chapters, Booksellers, with Chua Vang, who's in chapters 7 and 8 in the book. So we're going to do a conversation there. And we will not have any visual audio stuff other than our voices. And maybe we don't have slides. But basically, I have 6 comic books or graphic novels I've created in my 25-year career. And I'm probably best known for Blankets. That came out 22 years ago. It's a memoir about growing up in Wisconsin, about my family and my parents' religious faith and my falling from their faith. It's a coming-of-age romance. There's always been pressure from my publishers and from readers to do a sequel to Blankets, and I've always resisted that. Because one, I don't want to repeat myself. 2, there ends up being a lot of issues when you do autobio and memoir, as at least one cartoonist, a few cartoonists know in this audience. But here, in spite of myself, 22 years later, I find myself releasing a sequel of sorts to Blankets, at least in terms of going back to Wisconsin and my family and the small town I grew up in. Maybe we have no graphics. I wanted to show you what the inspiration for Ginseng Roots was. Okay. Or I can just hold the laptop. That's small enough, right? But yeah, so Ginseng Roots started, if we have visuals, I'll show you these later, but it started with probably the Chinese language edition of Blankets, which came out in 2007. And this was with a Taiwanese publisher, so it was a complex Chinese edition. They asked me to write a foreword for the book, and instead I drew a foreword. And in that foreword, I said that the closest I ever got to China was the ginseng I grew up working in. The small town I grew up in, the major crop and export was ginseng. And so in that edition of the Chinese language edition, or Chinese edition of Blankets, I showed ginseng for the first time. what?
Just gonna see.
Okay.
Just gonna see.
There's always some tech issue. There's never a PowerPoint expert in the crowd.
Right.
He's truly an expert in PowerPoint.
Yeah.
No one wants to be an expert.
People use PowerPoint anymore?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh.
Get in, do what we have to, then get out though. We don't learn anything.
So everyone has these
Yeah.
problems.
You learn some of them from oxygen.
I feel like we could dive into Q&A. Oh, me.
That'll do it.
Looking.
Yeah.
Okay,
Glad to
okay,
provide.
okay.
All right.
I think it just, sometimes it needs.
Could I, is this the store or is this Sophia's personal copy? Because I could just put it up here and teach.
Okay.
Let's do that. Then I can just click. All right, perfect. So I'll go ahead to that Chinese language edition I was mentioning. So yeah, this came out in 2007, and that was the foreword. It is really tiny, but that was the foreword I drew. And in the foreword, I say that the closest the rural Wisconsin town I grew up in got to China was the ginseng crops we grew and exported, and that during those long years toiling in the fields, I'm gonna read it. Digging up the strangely humanoid roots, I dreamt of a day I could live as an artist rather than a farmhand. There's also one panel in blankets. Can you see those over there? Too small? One panel in blankets, probably easily overlooked or misunderstood, which says the country boy's summer is consumed by agricultural labor. And probably the reader was looking at this panel not knowing what little Craig and little Phil are doing. We're picking rocks out of the field before the crop of ginseng can be planted. And I expand on this with an entire chapter in ginseng roots. That's what the pencils look like. I can see people straining to see this graphics book. And then the third big motivation for ginseng roots was Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire. I see some nodding heads too. I'm in a bookstore. So everyone knows Michael Pollan here. So he writes, he's a researcher, scientist, botanist that writes about food and biology. He wrote about 4 plants that shaped human civilization as much as we shaped them as a species. The apple, they all correspond to human desires. So the apple for sweetness, the tulip for beauty, cannabis for pleasure, and potato for sustenance. And I got pretty jazzed on this book and wanted to create my own book about plants. But unlike Michael Pollan, I'm not a researcher, academic, botanist, scientist. I'm not even really a gardener with a green thumb, so I was wondering what plant could I possibly have any intimacy or knowledge of. That's when I remembered spending a decade of my childhood working in ginseng agriculture. So as I started looking at ginseng, one of the first things I learned is that my small hometown of Marathon, Wisconsin was the largest producer of cultivated American ginseng in the world when I was a kid. This is a town of 1,200 people. Also, I guess I should clarify right up front, a lot of people don't even know what ginseng is. It's a plant, it's a medicinal herb, it's a root that's prized in Chinese medicine. If I go over in Asia, everybody knows what it is, and they know what Wisconsin ginseng is. But a lot of people aren't familiar that the plant is also indigenous to North America. So as far back as 1713, French Jesuit explorers recognized, with the help of the natives, that the plant was growing here already. And so they recognized its appeal for export and profit. And then not long after, in 1784, with the ratification of the Treaty of Paris, we sent our first ship to China. This is 1784, loaded primarily with American ginseng. And that was to pay off our debts to France for funding the American Revolution. So I like to say that there might not be a USA without ginseng, but certainly this was the cornerstone of our trade relationship with China before we were even a country. And for some reason, our trade relationship with China keeps coming up in the news. As I started research on the book, I was getting really excited about all these themes around globalization and the Chinese-American trade relationship, the changing shape of agriculture from small family farms to giant mega corporate farms, chemicals and pesticides we use on our foods, child labor in general, class divide in the U.S., also this political divide, separating the U.S. But when I would tell people I was working on, I could see their eyes glaze over with boredom. It just sounded like another research-heavy. Yeah, you're yawning. Research-heavy, like nonfiction sort of. Yeah, right. But when I would mention to people that it was my very first job when I was 10 years old, working 40 hours a week in the summer while other kids were at summer camp and playing video games, then people were interested. So that was like the first big cue that I had to lean back into memoir for this project. Also, this book, I started it in a moment of midlife career crisis. I've been doing comics for over 20 years, and it had become a tedious job, just like any other job. And along with that was my fear of graphic novels. I kind of came into comics, or this industry, with the era of the graphic novel with blankets. And that was really important to me because I wanted comics to be in bookstores and libraries. I wanted comics that had a spine that people read instead of collected in their long boxes with plastic bags. But in fact, now I found myself like a little weary of this format. They take a long time to start with. And I didn't want to work in my isolated cave for 10 years on another project. So to get out of that funk, I serialized this book as comic books with a Minneapolis-based publisher, Uncivilized Books. And this was my first time I got to work in this format of like the floppy comic book, 32-page format. And it was important to me because that was the format of comics that imprinted on me as a child. So when I started working Ginseng at age 10, my brother was age 7, we were paid $1 an hour. And in our young minds, that translated to one comic book an hour. We were a working class family. There wasn't an expendable income for like toys and candy, and in our case, comics. So if we wanted to afford indulgent things like comic books, we had to earn the money ourselves. We were happy for the work, and just as I say, there might not be a USA without Ginseng, I might not be a graphic novelist today if it weren't for all those 10 years toiling in the ginseng fields. I have a few videos in here. Oh, this actually, okay. The videos aren't working today, but here's the view from my parents' house. At least a couple people here know this view. Whoops. And if you pan to the right, you see the ginseng gardens there. It's pretty hard to see on this small screen, but they're very vast acreage. An acre is about the size of a football field. When I was a kid, ginseng gardens were like an acre or two. Now you'll see gardens that are 10 to even 50. How big do you think they get? 80? There's some huge gardens now. And they have these low to the ground, maybe 6 foot covered rooftops, which is usually it's like a vinyl shading, which is simulating like the forest canopy that ginseng would naturally grow in. So it's 80% shade because it's a delicate plant. It can't be exposed to direct sunlight, kind of like a mogwai. Sorry, very sensitive. Unlike Blankets, which was a memoir kind of reconstituted from my own memories and imagined poetic licensed dialogue, this book was much more a documentary, a la Joe Sacco's comics journalism. And all the dialogue in Ginseng comes directly from transcribed interviews with people I interviewed. So I had hours and hours of footage. I interviewed 80 people for this project. And then I transcribed that into hundreds of pages. And from those hundreds of pages, I would lift out a line or two. You can kind of see the highlighter on there. I'd find a line or two for the dialogue blooms. If the videos were working, I could show you some of the audio, or play some of the audio files alongside the pages, but I'm going to skip over the videos for now because I don't think they work. But one of these people's in the audience today. I won't out them until later. So I interviewed 80 people. Here we go. I interviewed 80 people for this book, and maybe a dozen made it into the final project. So when I was transcribing all those interviews, like some of them were really redundant, some of them were too technical or too focused on money or machinery, and some of them were just frankly boring to me. And if they were boring to me, they were going to be boring to the reader. So I had to find the interviews that I emotionally connected to. And I started by interviewing my earliest employers as a kid. This is my brother in the middle, Phil, with our first employers, Harold and Judy Baseman. And this is how they're depicted in the book. Wow, that is a sensitive keyboard. And this is our second employer, Joyce and Bear Breinel, who owned all the land around my parents' home. And they had Ginseng farmed all of that land. And this is the two of them in the book. Oh, thank you. And then finally, Raleigh Scripshack, who was the employer that got us to do all the rock picking in the fields, who I showed earlier on his old Farmall tractor. Pay attention to that tractor because I had to draw a lot of tractors in this book. But all these people that I worked for as kids are now retired from ginseng farming, so I realized I had to reach out to the modern day ginseng farmers, most of them who grow on a scale 100 times what I grew up working in. And probably the biggest grower in our hometown is Craig Ballman. I say in this panel that he looks like someone who would have beat me up in elementary school. But he's a super nice guy, really generous with his time. Like that, the pleasure of this book is it like got me out of like confines of my studio to interact with a lot of different people, some that I might not usually, brush shoulders with in regular life. This is the second biggest grower, but in some, you could argue the biggest grower, Will Sue, with his, you can't see on the small of the screen, but his license plate on his, how he refers to ginseng. And then you can see one of the modern day mega tractors in the background that don't really resemble at all the tractors I grew up working with and driving in the fields. Will's father, Paul, has also, he founded their ginseng farming. He's since retired from the industry, but now he conducts ginseng tourism in our hometown, which before this project I did not know existed. People are bussed out from all over, you didn't know this either, bussed out from all over the U.S. To come see how ginseng is grown in Wisconsin. I interviewed Chinese medicine practitioners. This is Justin Penoyer, who also grows wild simulated ginseng in the forest. So he's trying to grow ginseng in its natural forest canopy. And Carmen Chin, who's an herbalist from where I was living in Portland, Oregon, and how she's depicted in the book. Both of these doctors I eventually saw as a patient over the course of this project. So it wasn't just research. I interviewed all the branding and distribution people, like the Ginseng Board of Wisconsin. This is the Ginseng Queen at our local festival, and how she's depicted in the book. And then I traveled with my little brother Phil to Asia. We went to Northeast China and to South Korea to do ginseng research. This is a wild ginseng market in Northeast China, in Jilin province. Where people were selling wild ginseng that they claimed was 100 years old. 100 years old is unlikely, but from the looks of this root, maybe 30. What do you think, Joe?
Oh, 30.
You can tell that with the wild ginseng, you can tell from the length of this, the neck, they call it, which is before the stalk and from the root, and it kind of knots up and twists, and you can count the knots to count the years, just the way you can count rings on a tree. And this was a cultivated ginseng market in Ginseng, South Korea, which is considered the cultivated ginseng capital of the world now. And this is Yang Misuk, one of the wholesalers there, and how she was drawn in the book. Oops. And this is Nina, our interpreter, for when we went to Northeast China. This was a very hard to reach region of China. It's like not a place that Western tourists tend to go. It's right on the border of North Korea. It was hard to get to, you couldn't fly directly. And certainly we wouldn't have been able to do anything without an interpreter. So here you can see how I photo reference things for the book. This is Nina. And she's responsible for us getting all those interviews while we were in Northeast China, including with this guy, Hu Chen, who was a wild ginseng hunter in Erdo Bahai in the mountains. And this guy, Min Quinn Bao, was a wild ginseng dealer, where wild ginseng is very expensive and framed on the wall like works of art. Finally, my favorite person I interviewed for the whole book is Chua Bang here. with his brother Chris Doogie, work in the fields. I actually joined them for a little bit of a root harvest. So probably any journalist can tell you that most people, like what a journalist is doing is they're taking their interviews and trying to make them digestible and interesting to the regular reader. But in the case of Chua Bang, he was already a natural storyteller himself, so I didn't have to do that much work. So you're really lucky when you meet this kind of person. I mean, I'm lucky on many levels. I guess I'll call him out tonight right now because he's here in the audience. Thank you for being here, Chua. Brother Chua, my best friend that I've made in the course of this project, and his story had such an intense emotional resonance because it was not only about farming, it was about his relationship with his father, it was about his father's refugee experience coming from Laos during America's war in Vietnam. So all of that was such an important couple of chapters 7 and 8 in the book. I'll talk more about that later. When I was a kid in the 1980s, this is what root harvest looked like. It was just small family farms, and the farmers would get their kids or the local teenagers and just a handful of people to help out in the fields during the harvest. But by the 1990s, the primary labor force was among refugees from Laos, and that kind of coincided with a few things. One, the gardens were growing exponentially, so now you had these massive gardens. Two, white people weren't really willing to do agricultural work anymore, so there was this deficit in the labor force. And then there was a huge influx of refugees, Hmong refugees from Laos and Thailand. So during America's war in Vietnam, actually I should go back here, sorry, getting ahead of myself. I'm in Minnesota right now, so everything is cool here. Everybody knows who Hmong people are. Other parts of the world and or United States, people are less familiar. So I apologize if this is redundant for everyone here in the audience. But a lot of people aren't super familiar with the Hmong people because they've not necessarily had a homeland of their own. They're one of the many ethnic minorities from China. We have some idea of how poorly China treats its ethnic minorities. During the Quinn dynasty in the 1800s, most of them were exiled and they resettled in the mountains of Laos, which was this treacherous hilly terrain that nobody else wanted to live in, let alone farm. Then during the Americans' war in Vietnam, the country of Laos was established as a neutral territory by the Geneva Accords, and the communists overstepped those accords by routing much of the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos. In retaliation, the Americans sent in the CIA to recruit a guerrilla army of tribal hills people, mostly Hmong people, to fight for American interests. But then, in classic American fashion, once we pulled out of the conflict in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, we abandoned our allies there. And so only 2,500 Hmong people were airlifted out of Laos at that time, and the rest were left to be slaughtered by the enemies, the Pathet Lao and the communists. And about a third of the population died during that time. And then the ones that were lucky escaped across the Mekong River to refugee camps, primarily in Thailand. And then, over the course I should also mention that Laos is the most bombed country in world history, and those are U.S. bombs, 580,000 bombing sorties. They say there's 270 million bomblets still unexploded in the soil, and it's farmers and children are still coming upon us today and losing limbs or lives. So, I mean, it's 50 years after the conflict ended, people are still getting maimed from those bomblets. Also, Hmong people are still being persecuted in Laos 50 years after the war ended. So some people have said it's the longest ongoing genocide. So those who were lucky made it to refugee camps in Thailand. Some just spent a short amount of time there, like a year or two. Others spent 20 years there before they were able to get permanent settlement somewhere else. And Minnesota being number one, St. Paul, Minnesota is the number one Hmong population in the United States, and after that, Wausau, Wisconsin, which is where Marathon is. So, again, every farmer I interviewed for this book said that the ginseng industry in Wisconsin would not have survived if not for the Hmong people and their willingness to do the hard labor in the fields. Here's a really rough draft of what a page might look like. most of my books, I draw and write a rough draft of the book before I start drawing final art. This book was a little different because I started with those interviews. So I started with text, lots of text first, and then I had to move that around. So I moved it around digitally, and then would draw, pencil things digitally, and print out a blue line that I could ink on paper. So that was the final inks are always on paper, and then I add a color digitally also. But going through the middle of this panel, this page, you can see the Hmong story cloths. Pretty hard to see here, but you can go to, there's a Hmong museum in St. Paul. Has anyone been there? And they have some of these story cloths on display. That place is a big resource for me. Here's one from a book, but again, pretty hard to see at this scale. You gotta go see one in person. While they were in the refugee camps in Thailand, they started making these narrative pictorial blankets to communicate the refugee exodus experience. So up in the upper right-hand corner is the war, the conflict, the slaughtering of innocent civilians. Through the middle is the Mekong River that people had to cross to safety. Here's a close-up of the Mekong. You can see like a little handmade bamboo raft there too. And then if they made it across, they made it to refugee camps, and mostly in Thailand. And then in the lowest corner, you also see big jets flying people to places like Minnesota and Wisconsin, the primary resettlement areas in the world. So as the author of blankets, you can imagine why pictorial narrative blankets were very inspiring to me. And speaking of blankets, people are always asking me about the book and wondering if everything in the book is true. And I say yes, if everything in blankets happened. The fiction is in what I removed. And probably the biggest element I removed from blankets is the fact that I have a sister. So when I scandalized. So when I started this book, I wasn't sure if I should include my sister in this book, if it would be confusing to the reader. I honestly didn't remember that my sister even worked in ginseng, because she only did it for a year or two before she extracted herself to do babysitting instead. But one of the things I very quickly learned is that of everyone in my family, my sister has the best recall. My mother says she has no memories of childhood at all, even my own childhood. My brother says he's wired pretty similarly. He doesn't remember things. But my sister's at the opposite end of the spectrum. So she was a crucial resource for tilling up these memories. And, I thought the book was going to bring me closer to my brother. I thought it was about my relationship with my brother, who is not even here tonight. But instead the book brought me closer to my sister. And I think part of that was finally amending this omission from Blankets, this small crime of memoir, and giving her this chance to have her own voice on paper. I won't be able to show these videos, but when I was working on the book, I also had the camera turned back on me and my brother. While we were in South Korea, we were followed around by I see that nodding head, someone else here was in this video. So it was a television crew working on their own documentary about ginseng. And they had just been to Marathon in Wausau, Wisconsin 2 weeks prior and interviewed a lot of the same people as I did. But they also wanted my brother and I to be figures in their documentary. And I did bring some video footage of that, but the video's not working on this, so we're going to just skip over those. They're funny though. Take my word for it. It was also while I was in China that I learned that the biggest producer of Wisconsin ginseng in the world is actually China. Oops, sorry. Spoiler. It's China. So it was Quinn that introduced us to this concept that he said, no, we've been growing Wisconsin ginseng here for 40 years. Grown from Wisconsin seed, but in Chinese soil, which prompted me to question, like, what does it mean to be authentic in an age of globalization? Mm-hmm. And that's a theme running throughout the book. And my apologies for the next horrible scene that you already saw. While I was in Taiwan, that's when I first learned about then President Trump's ties to Wisconsin ginseng by way of Terry Go, who is considered the Trump of Taiwan. Terry Go is the chairman of Foxconn. It's the world's largest electronics manufacturer. They make iPhones and Xboxes. They employ 1 million people, the largest employer in all of China. And during Trump's first administration, he was negotiating a deal with Terry Go to establish a Foxconn plant in Wisconsin, and which was funded by the largest state subsidies in U.S. history, $4 billion from the state of Wisconsin. And as you can imagine, all of that went sideways. But while Terry Go was in Wisconsin, he was also trying to establish his own Wisconsin Ginseng brand. The other reason I had to include Trump in the book, and I have thought of taking these images out of my talk, because I made this talk back in August, before the re-election, but it's still in there. And anyway, is because of Wisconsin's big role in Trump's his first election. So Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan were these 3 states that historically always went Democratic and flipped to Republican in the 2016 elections. I was living in Los Angeles at the time of the 2016 elections, and everybody pointed their fingers at me to explain what was happening in America, because I was the one that was from the interior of the states. I was the one from a small town, working class community, of places that helped determine Trump's win. And they wanted me to explain what's happening. This is Jewish father, Abraham or Guy Yivang. And so I don't have a true explanation for Trump's why he's in power. But I think part of it is that America is a place that's always trying to erase its past. It was settled by people fleeing trauma and conflict in their home countries, and they just wanted to erase that past. They tried to erase the past of the people already inhabiting this land. Obviously, we're trying to ignore 300 years of slavery and ignore that part of our founding. It's also a country of pop culture that's always trying to bulldoze everything that came before. Fast media. Also it's a home of, this video works. Why this one and none of the rest? It's also a home of kind of born-again Christianity. So I just got back from 4 months of touring in Europe, where people say like, oh yeah, I understand Christianity, etc. I'm like, well, it's a little different in America. Like we have, it's spread the world now, but we have born-again evangelical Christianity, which is a different flavor. My parents, my mother grew up Catholic, my father grew up Baptist, but when they were in their 20s, they became born-again Christians, and they ended up abandoning their families. They moved away from their hometown in Michigan, and I didn't grow up with grandparents or cousins. My parents went to find a new family that was a church community. So I grew up in many layers of sheltered isolation, but one of them is being in this sort of small religious community that did not extend beyond it. This is me at my baptism at age 11. See my big ears there. Anybody here get baptized in the Muddy River? Yeah, nice. There we go. Do you like how I'm plugging my totally wussy? And maybe some Wisconsinites know this river. This is a Red River that flows through our hometown, and that's how I drew it in the book. My parents left behind their families, and I never really had a sense of where I came from. This is the third big element that I omitted from blankets. So there was agricultural labor, there was my sister, and then there was the fact that I was pulled out of school in my senior year to be Christian homeschooled. Maybe that's a future project, but this is blankets era Craig with my mom, and here's my dad. And of everybody I interviewed for this book, the only people who pushed back on the interviews were my parents. And they were very willing participants with the first chapter, the first issue. After the second chapter, they kind of pulled back on their participation because they wanted the book to be about farming rather than family. And this concerned me because, as much as I knew I was going to interview all these different people, the growers, the sellers, the scientists, the practitioners, I knew that I was going to go to the other side of the world, to China and Korea, but I also knew I had to come back to my small community and most of all to my family. So it started to worry me that my parents were withdrawing their volunteer participation in the project. When the last issue came out, I was really worried. And my mom, in fact, her initial response is like, well, I never said that. And my siblings laughed because they'd heard my mom say this 100 times. Plus, I had it recorded. But thankfully, in the end, they did sign off on the book. They gave it their blessing. And again, I think it was very similar to the dynamic with my sister. I think the fact that I included my parents in the process of this book, with blankets, I just kind of did it behind their back. I think it was a book I started it when I was 23, and if I was seeking my parents' approval, I wouldn't have gotten it, and it would have shut down that project altogether. That book was sort of like a coming out story for me. But with this one, I really tried to involve everybody that's in the book, and give them a chance to edit or change anything they said in print. And so I was very grateful in the end my parents signed off on the book. But when the final issue of the series came out, this is a year and a half ago now, my father had a massive stroke. And my initial reaction was guilt. Like, did the stress of this book, this project, contribute to his mental health decline? So he's okay. He's physically okay. He didn't lose his physical capacities, but he has severe aphasia, so he lost a lot of his verbal capacities. And what happened is that guilt kind of transformed into a gratitude that I'd recorded my father, both in the audio recordings, the video recordings, and maybe most of all the drawn versions of the page, and put down his dialogue and his voice while he still had it. And it's been a year and a half now. My dad is recovering. The slowest thing and the hardest thing, I mean, he's still working on every form of communication and vocabulary, but he also lost all the things he knows how to do, whether that was, well, reading and writing, obviously, but also plumbing, which was his lifelong career, household things, but biggest of all was gardening, because gardening was my dad's happy place. Like, when he got home from a hard day of work, he would go out to the garden, and that was, one of my friends said that was kind of his pagan place. That was his space to commune with nature and to collaborate with nature, and he loved growing things and then sharing them with people. And so over the course of this book, I'm super grateful for the fact that it took me out of my studio and that sort of isolation, making a graphic novel, to interact with so many different people. And one thing my mother always said, because we left our grandparents and we left our cousins, she said, like, family is not just about blood. There's many different forms of family. And I think there's great wisdom in what my mom says, and I think that too is a huge theme going through this book. And so I like to end the talk with this image of Chua and I in his garden. This is Chua, Brother Chua, presenting me a yearling, a 1-year ginseng plant. And I guess I gotta call up Chua because he's here today. Thank you for making the 3-hour drive from Marathon, Merrill, through the crazy weather. And yes, I love Chua. The best thing that's come out of this whole project is the bond we have. And I've also seen my parents really, take you under their wings, and I've seen them give witness or bear example of the fact that family is not just blood family. We make our families along the way, and I'm super grateful to have befriended you. So thanks for being here.
Same here too, Craig. You know that.
Thank you. So we got some time for Q&A. Or if you have questions for Chua, we'll put this one too.
Oh, I noticed you were showing the pictures of Northeast China, and they have shade cloth, but they were shade cloth on the mountains? Were they growing in the mountains with shade cloth?
No, they're actually just using plastic there.
Oh,
so
really? Okay.
They have most of the gardens were hoops, small hoops, with plastic, and there's a little more ventilation around the sides.
Okay.
They definitely grow in a different way, but I guess I should clarify that Asian ginseng and American ginseng are also different plants. They're sister species. They look pretty similar, but they do have different medicinal properties. And so, also, I mean, I talk in the book about how many chemicals are on ginseng. There's certainly a lot because it's a very delicate crop. It takes 3 to 5 years to grow, and it's very susceptible to disease and fungus. And so it needs a regular weekly fungicide and pesticide application. But it's no different than the cannabis that people are smoking. And it's actually better than the food we're eating. Michael Pollan writes about potatoes in his book, and potatoes have way more pesticides than ginseng. And he talks about how like a potato crop, russet potatoes, they have to be off gas for 3 days before someone can be in the same room as them. So I read about, but yeah, so in China I saw a lot of chemicals on the plants too. Maybe they use different chemicals or more chemicals, but they had a different roofing system.
Okay. So, but do they still, is it
But
just
they're low to
massive
the ground too.
fields?
They're like this,
Yeah.
this
Is
big.
it, okay, is it just as massive of fields?
Yes, or bigger.
Oh, okay.
Bigger. Yeah, there's a lot of land in China, especially in northeast China, which is
Yeah.
agricultural. In the book too, I talk about every farmer said that the future of the industry is in like its application in pharmaceuticals, and so they're working to synthesize the components of ginseng, like the ginsenosides, and most of that research is being done in Wuhan, in fact, which is right there in the midst of all the actual Chinese medicine and the agriculture, but they have many labs to try to synthesize the components of herbal medicines to figure out how to apply them to pharmaceuticals. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your page layout? I love how varied they always are and interesting and kind of how you go about.
Oh, thank you. Well, for me, it's like some cartoonists just focus on a box, and maybe they'll have a grid. They'll have a 6-panel grid or a 9-panel grid. Or for me, that's a little boring and sometimes claustrophobic, especially for people who don't regularly read comics, to look at a page with that many frames. So I tend to think of like the 2 pages facing the spread as the initial frame, and if I can eliminate panels, all the better. I'm taking inspiration from Joe Sacco, the comics journalist I referenced earlier, who tends to work that way too. There's a lot of people who do, but I think that's kind of where it starts. But then, like, how do you make that readable? How do you direct the reader's eye to follow the word balloons in the right order? But with a book like Ginseng, it's also a very organic book. You know, it tended to be in fields and nature, so it's easier to break the grid when you're in a more organic setting. Yeah.
Well, because it's the first time you've really serialized one or published it serially, did it change your process in any way? Did you
Oh yeah.
feedback?
Great question about the serialization. So the serial is different from the book. There's about 60 or 70 pages added to the book. And what happened is once I finished the serialized version, which was, again, it was like summer of 2023, I finished serializing it. But then I sat down and read all 12 issues in succession, and I was unhappy with the book. It didn't feel like a book. It felt like it was missing a narrative arc. And so I puzzled over that for a year, wrestled with it, and added 60 to 70 new pages. And probably there's a lot of huge additions actually to the book, but that narrative arc that connects it all now is like my health crisis, because I have ongoing problems with my drawing hand, and they very much relate to my trips to China and getting ginseng as treatments for my hands. So that's probably the biggest addition. But as far as like, probably the coolest thing about the serialization is we did like an old school letters page in the back. So kind of like in the comics in the 80s, like people had a letters column. And I did the same thing, and it was really cool because people wrote in their stories of their own like childhood jobs. And it's also a timestamp on what was going on in US history or world history at the time, because there was the pandemic, there was George Floyd's murder, there was the January 6th insurrection riots, and and people were writing about these things in real time. So I love that the series is a time capsule of that. Also, the series has more comics by my brother. So in the series, my brother's doing 1 or 2 pages for every issue, and only a handful of those made it into the final book. So that's kind of an extra goodie in the series. But I didn't do it as some gimmick so people would buy both versions. I kind of always knew like that the series was a first draft to some degree. I only focused on writing 1 chapter at a time rather than thinking of it holistically initially. Yes?
That was the same.
Same question. Wow. Yeah.
What are some of your favorite graphic novels that were originally like serialized? And you'll probably say Joe Sacco again, but any
Yeah,
others?
Joe Sacco. And actually, Joe Sacco is a good example because Palestine, nobody paid attention to that at all
Yeah.
as a comic book. It was a Fantagraphics' worst-selling comic book. But then once it was made into a book, people sort of got it. But it sort of came out as a book just as graphic novels were getting some attention too. Let's see, serialized. I love Adrian Tomina's work. He did let's see, Shortcomings. I mean, he's got many great ones.
It's a
I
film
think.
now, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm okay on film, but
That's
like,
good.
but I think Adrian Tomina's stuff is probably more fun to read as comics because he made such beautiful object comic books. And, pretty much anything he did is a good example. Do you have one?
Those are good examples. I think about Bone too. Bone
Okay.
was serialized. Yeah.
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 Some manga stuff like Akira was originally serialized.
True.
Yeah.
That was a big influence as a kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious why you chose red.
Oh, great question. So 2 parts. I mean, one, there's the Chinese culture part that's maybe obvious. People think of Mao's Little Red Book or Chinese propaganda posters, like communist propaganda posters. Also, all the branding for ginseng is always red, like both here and in Asia. But it also ties to Wisconsin because all across the landscape in Wisconsin is red barns. I was wondering why are barns red? It's because originally, the old school version is they would mix animal's blood into paint as a antifungal agent to protect the straw. Later they put ferrous oxide, and then it just became a tradition that barns were red. There's no reason for them to be red now. It's just like what we think barns should be. Ginseng is harvested in fall when all the sugar maples are turning blaze red, and I always associate fall colors with ginseng harvest, both visually and the smell. Also, the ginseng berry or seeds are this really vibrant red. For wild ginseng hunters, the only time they can really find ginseng is when the seeds are out at the end of summer. It's like a beacon in the forest to find the plant. And so for all those reasons, red seemed like the natural choice. And I like the constraint of just having one extra color. There's only black and red ink in the book, but I used layers of both colors to make a whole sepia tone array. Yeah.
One of the pictures, I was taken by the brushes that you were using, and when I think of all the detail that you have, I was wondering, do you just use brush, or you have to?
So those are some of the many tools I used. I especially like a good ratty brush like that because I really abuse brushes. I use watercolor brushes, which are supposed to be used with water, but I use them with India ink, so it tends to destroy brushes really quickly. You can see I use toothbrushes and different things like that, and also sumi brushes for big, broad gestural strokes. And then here you can see the blue lines that I print out. So I print out the blue lines that I've drawn digitally and then work on paper with the ink. Because I always wanted ink to be on paper, and I want a final piece of artwork. And then I would lay some vellum or bond paper over to make the second color, so you can see them up close, the sort of dry brush to get the second tone. And then I scan that in and deal with that in Photoshop. So a lot of back and forth. Here's again the blue lines. If I bump up the contrast, you can see how faintly they're printed on the paper so that I can ink on that. That's the proper way to hold a brush, and this is the way I hold a brush, which is more like a child's claw, the way I learned to draw when I was 4. And then this is the end papers for the book, about half inked. And then there's the final inks. Yeah.
So I've noticed that your art style has remained pretty consistent since blankets, with some developments and like a refinement with Ginseng roots. I'm wondering when you kind of like settled on your art style, or you felt like confident moving forward with it.
Oh no, I don't ever feel confident
Yeah.
in it. And I actually think they're kind of different. I mean, yeah, the blankets, I've been using a brush the whole time, and so that kind of establishes a certain style. If I changed my tool, it would probably change the style pretty drastically. I did a travelogue book, Carnet de Voyage, which I just drew on the road. So I was using brush pens for that, or just pens sometimes, whatever I had at hand. And then Space Dumplings, the kids' book, is very slick. It's a very slick detail. It's still done drawn with a brush, but it's colored digitally, so it just has much more of a digital look about it. But no, and then Habibi, I remember drawing it all with a brush, and I would draw these Arabic like designs and patterns, and like a crazy person, anybody else would like maybe rubber stamp and repeat the patterns, but I'd fill up this, Arabic patterns just with a tiny little delicate brush, and it would take me 3 days to do one of those pages. But I was like, I guess I was looking at like Gustave Doré engravings and stuff. I'm like, this is a book that should be engraved rather than drawn with a brush. But I am kind of loyal to brushes, I think. Yeah.
So I did not like gardening at all.
Did you have to work in Ginseng?
Well, my dad used to, because we're his kids, he used to have us go out there and work with him. But I was, I'm the oldest, so I was lucky I got to stay home, got to babysit my baby sister.
Oh, yes.
But I was just curious, when you were a kid and you were gardening, what did you do to entertain yourself? Because I used to kind of just like sing.
Oh, yeah.
And then, me and my siblings would purposely just kind of pick fights with each other. Or when I had an iPod, then I finally was just kind of like, got to kind of
You're
listen
way
to
younger
music.
than, yeah.
Yes.
No iPods. No. There was no fun to be had. The fun was like my brother and I chatting about the comic books we were going to buy as we were
Oh.
working. That was what got us through the work days.
Yeah.
It was just like ticking down hours. Like, one more comic book. Just
Yes.
made one more comic book. My dad reminded us that we worked for a couple of employers that wouldn't let us talk in the fields. No
Oh.
talking loud.
Wow.
Yeah. No singing, definitely.
Are you still a fan of Brew?
Sure. I mean, I haven't kept up with it.
I've
no.
seen you.
But I think my obsessive detail probably comes from reading through Sergio Aragonis comics as a kid, because his stuff was, what's the word, hypographic. Like he covered every inch of space on his pages. I had a friend that thought that might be like a working class thing, because paper was very precious in our house. So that when you had a piece of paper, which was already recycled, it was like computer paper that had printing on the other side, but we would try to use every square inch of space on the paper, which is maybe why I just developed that obsessive detailed style. And Sergio Aragonis is from Mexico, and I'm sure he probably had a shortage of paper where he grew up too.
I have a few questions a little bit, but you said you've been touring for 9 months, and so I'm curious just about responses, anything interesting or surprising about the way that people have looked.
Oh, great question. Okay, so yeah, I started touring at the end of August, and I have not been anywhere. I've just been living out of a suitcase ever since then, wearing this shirt pretty much every day. So, I mean, I think as with Blankets is a book that really surprised me, that like I didn't think anybody would read that book, and I didn't think people would relate to it, because it was very much about a specific kind of sheltered upbringing in a small town in rural Wisconsin. And instead, it's been a very successful book globally. And I travel around the world, to Russia, to the Middle East, where I meet all these huge fans of Blankets, so that blows my mind. This book seems similar in a way. Definitely I'm getting a lot of stories about people's childhood jobs. It's maybe too soon to say. I mean, Blankets has been out for 20 years, but I do feel like this book is I think readers and critics get this book, and I don't think they got my last couple of books. I don't think even when people noticed I did a book called Space Dumplings, you know. So I'm kind of hopeful about the legs on this, but who knows, you know. Yes, that's great.
Is 9 months like the normal length for
No, I think I have the record for cartoonists, for sure. Because even Joe Sacco, did I bring him up earlier? Joe even told me he never travels for more than 2 months or 2 weeks at a time.
Wow.
And that's not true. He just got back from Egypt. He was there for 3 weeks. But he said that's like a very long trip for him. He says, I don't travel for more than 2 or 3 weeks before just being at home for a while to recover and recoup. But I instead just like got rid of my home and my apartment and just have been living out of a suitcase ever since. And part of that was just to do a tour to promote the book. It's hard for books to get any attention. Part of it was I've been cooped up for 10 years, so I wanted to see the world. And then I wanted a sabbatical. I wanted to, also during the course of this whole project, I didn't really have a home. I moved 12 times. So I moved like between LA, Minneapolis, and we lived here 2 summers in Portland, Oregon. I moved through 12 different locations during the course of the book. And so I was hoping by the end of it I would figure out where I was meant to be, where my home was, where I belonged, and I haven't. So I'm still traveling for the indefinite future. Yeah.
Are there other like art forms that inspire your work, other than like comics, like music, or anything? Is there anything else you?
Yeah, everything. I think it's really healthy not to get or to get inspiration outside of comics. So in the case of this book, I mean, I already mentioned Michael Pollan, but writers like Michael Pollan, nonfiction writers about plants. Robin Wall Kimmer's Braiding Sweetgrass was a big influence too. All the Chinese woodblock printing and watercolors, the Hmong tapestries, the story cloths. Chinese text in general was a huge inspiration. I think for any cartoonist, to still see the pictographic roots of language is inspiring. Lately, I've been really into medieval religious iconography. Go figure, maybe that's going to inform some future project. But it's like I lived in LA for 3 years. I saw a lot of amazing contemporary art. But now that I'm traveling through Europe and stuff, I'm always obsessed with seeing the medieval art collections, and that sort of, I don't know, something about religious paintings right now are doing it for me. So, and I've been rereading a lot of theology and memoirs. Patti Smith, I've been revisiting her books because of the 50th anniversary of Horses. So, always my inspiration tends to come from outside of comics, which I think is healthy for cartoonists. We were talking about one of the comic schools earlier today, and I think there's maybe a danger if it's just like all your only focus and your only influence is comics.
So I play music. All my influence comes from outside of music.
I love that.
I ask 'cause I'm always curious what other people are influenced by.
Oh, cool. Yes, and of course I listen to music too. Most healthy people do. Is that the note to end on? Should we have time for one more? 'Cause I want to make sure we do some signing too. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, how hard was it to do the Chinese
Characters?
Yeah.
I'm just tracing. It's very similar to Habibi. I did try to learn, I had it in my head like I'm going to learn calligraphy, and the whole design motif of the book is based on the calligraphy worksheets that you get with the grid that's been divided like that. But yeah, I didn't have the time or patience to actually learn. Like I always think I'm going to have this luxury of time, and then suddenly years have gone by, and you're like, oh no, I got to make a book. I mean, especially with research-driven books like this, like I could get caught up in the research perpetuity. It becomes a bit of a procrastination device, and so eventually I'm like, oh, okay, I should probably sit down and make a book now, instead of just always reading. Chu and I gave a talk to a college, and I was talking about how, like, with the chapters 7 and 8 that focused on the Hmong refugee crisis, sometimes I read an entire book just to inform one panel. So, like a half a week would go by, or a week, like of just reading, and then like, okay, I got this one piece of information to draw one panel in a book. There's more than one panel in the book, so I had to keep moving on. Is that the note to end on?
One last question.
I love it.
What are you most proud of in this book?
My friendship with Chula. I'm proud that I've survived this project. It was the most strenuous book I ever made. And that was, a lot of compounding things, like, besides the obvious, I mean, we all lived through a pandemic, and that slowed down life a lot. I also moved 12 times, that slowed it down. Serialization slowed it down. I probably lost a couple of years just in the process of serializing. But certainly the upheaval of moving all the time, and every new place I would set up shop, I'd have to get a new desk. So sometimes I was drawing in a bedroom or a basement or a garage or an attic space, or sometimes I actually had an office. It was always setting up a new studio would take so much time. And then just the midlife crisis of the project, not knowing if I was going to continue in comics at all. And during the course of this whole book, I was promising all my friends, this is it. This is my swan song, and I will definitely leave comics after this and find a real job that pays the bills. And I feel a little bit different after my tour in Europe. I got very bolstered there, felt different there to be a cartoonist in a good way. And so, I just felt like, I'm in a place that likes books and likes art, and I felt more encouraged that maybe there's a future. But I mean, it's also the classic existential crises of everybody in the age of, apocalypse and AI and global turmoil. So usually when I finish a book, I feel a postpartum depression. But with this one, I felt like this immense sense of relief that I'd survived something. That's the ending. Go ahead. Awesome, thank you. So let's sign some books. Usually I try to just do one drawing per person, but I'll sign any books. I want to make sure I can, I say one drawing because if you have multiple copies, I'll give you copies. But just make sure I can get through all the books